Hello, class, and welcome to this week where we will be exploring creativity in psychopathology as well as psychosis. And what we're going to do is jump right into some research by an eminent schizophrenia researcher by the name of Nancy Andreasen. Now, Andreasen wanted to do research on the relationship or potential relationship between schizophrenia and creativity. And what schizophrenia tends to be, some of the symptoms tend to be a hearing of voices, flatness of affect, psychotic episodes, loss of touch with reality. And she was inspired by a research project that came out in the 1960s. Now, this 1960 study by Heston looked at children who had been adopted away and were either children of schizophrenic mothers or non-schizophrenic mothers to do a comparison. And what he found was that the children of schizophrenic mothers were more involved in creative professions and had higher creativity scores. And I'll say that again. He found that the children of schizophrenic mothers were more involved in creative professions and had higher creativity scores than were the adopted away children of non-schizophrenic mothers. And so Andreasen wanted to do a follow-up study to this Heston study. And so what she did was look at 30 preeminent writers from the prestigious University of Iowa Writers' Workshop. Now, what Andreasen did was look at these 30 authors and their first-degree relatives. That is, their parents, their siblings, their children, and compared them to 30 matched pairs. So they matched them in terms of socioeconomic status, education, and so on in the control. And the control's first-degree relatives. And what she did was do diagnostic interviews with all of the participants and their first-degree relatives. And what she was expecting to find was a higher incidence of schizophrenia in the first-degree relatives of the authors. Now, as sometimes happens, that didn't work out. And because she was comparing the creatives to the controls, and what she found was that there was in fact no schizophrenia in any of the participants. So, her initial hypothesis was not proven out, but what she did find is that there were affective disorders. That is, the writers and their first-degree relatives were 3 times more likely to have anxiety or depression. 3 times more likely than the controls to have anxiety or depression. And you need to kind of remember here that anxiety and depression are structurally within the brain very similar, and they often occur very comorbid. And they were also 4 times more likely to have bipolar disorder. That's an emotional regulation disorder, where a person moves from depression through to mania. They were also 4.5 times more likely to be alcoholic, and alcoholism can oftentimes be tied in with anxiety and depression, a way of managing anxiety, for example. It also turned out that the first-degree relatives of the authors were more creative than the first-degree relatives of the control. And so, what she concluded from her research was that both mood disorders and creativity tends to run in families, based upon her research. Now, what we know of affective disorders, so anxiety, depression, and that sort of thing, is that it is both a blessing and a curse. It is a blessing because a person that tends to develop anxiety and depression are those people that are more sensitive to the environment. They're your therapists, your natural therapists. They're more in tune with emotional cues of others. Unfortunately, Being so sensitive to the emotional cues of others and to environmental factors also means that you can be hurt more easily and have your, what we could think of is our alarm system set at a higher level. We sometimes call this the HPA axis, your hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis system. So it genetically gets set so high, essentially, that it can cause, over a period of time, affective disorders. So you will end up experiencing, over a period of time, possibly depression or crippling anxiety. And so this does tie into what Nancy Andreasen found in her study. So you can kind of think of it in terms of you are given a gift that enables you to see and experience the world in a way that a third of the population is not able to do, but it also leaves you a little bit vulnerable. So you need to be mindful of that if you are someone that experiences this. And then there is the author of the book Touched with Fire, Kay Jamison, who did a study on mood disorders of artists and writers. So she examined 47 preeminent artists and writers from Britain. They've won high medals and awards, and she was looking for evidence of affective illness and had a number of other things that she was looking for within her study. So she was looking for comparing the rates. So for her total sample, the number who were treated for bipolar, and so on. So now in the general population, the number treated for bipolar is about 1.4% of the population would be treated for bipolar. But in her study, the creatives, 7% of the authors had been treated for bipolar, and 16% of the poets had been treated for bipolar. So significantly higher. Really, I mean, if you think about it, that is so much higher than what is found in the general population. And when she also looked at the number treated for depression, it was 17%. Or it is 17% generally in the general population. And her sample was 23%. Again, looking at poets, a full 1/3, so 33% of them were treated for depression. And those treated for any kind of affective illness was at a rate of 62%. So almost 2/3 of these authors, these creative authors, had been treated for some kind of affective disorder. So this is very much higher than what you would find in the general population. Now, another thing that she would interested in looking at was productivity and mood disorders. And so she graphed the rises in mood changes and compared that with the productivity numbers. So for these artists and writers, and what she did was plot out the productivity scores against their mood changes. So it looks like she looked at the periods of greatest productivity, and it seems to be that at the beginning of an elevation in mood is when productivity tends to be the greatest. Elevation of productivity seems to fit nicely with not being disordered, but having an improvement in your mood. And it seems to fit nicely between a normal mood and a disordered mood. So if you look at the association between positive mood and cognition, what researchers have found is that divergent thinking scores increase after people have an unexpected reward, for example. So something very simple as giving them $1 when they weren't expecting it. It makes them feel good, and then when researchers would check their mood, and they would report having an elevated mood because of this, And then if you would test them, they would show higher divergent thinking scores, which I think is pretty interesting. Now, here's the thing. It isn't that there was higher productivity when the person actually feels good. It was rather when the mood was improving that the highest productivity was. When you're going from that depression up to normal, there was high productivity. Or when you were going from normal up to a hypomanic phase, productivity was higher. So these times are apparently the times of high productivity. So some researchers will suggest that one way to get yourself motivated to be productive is to give yourself a little gift, an unexpected gift. Go buy yourself some shoes or something, and that will help you be more productive because you're elevating your mood a little bit. And it's that transition in the mood that helps you to be a little more motivated. Now, here's an interesting study. This one was done by Shelley Carson from Harvard. And what she wanted to do was look at the therapeutic levels of light and their effect upon creativity. That is, having 10,000 lux of light, full spectrum light, that is basically the light that you get from the sun, and sitting in front of that for over 15 minutes. So for at least 15 minutes, but between 20 and 30 minutes ideally, and how it affects a person's productivity. And she looked at 76 people, half in experimental and half in controls, and each had to sit in front of a light box for about 20 minutes a day for 2 weeks. And then she tested them pre and post on creativity measures and divergent thinking tasks. And what she found was that people who had the actual light rather than the placebo light, so they had the same box, but the quality of the light was very different. One was just a regular light bulb, where the other one was a therapeutic light with 10,000 lux full spectrum light. And what she showed is that there's a difference in the therapeutic light as opposed to the placebo light. And this has to do with resetting your clock and your hormones and setting yourself up to see the positive things in life. It sets up your neurotransmitters in a way where you're ready for the day. So now we're going to go to do is look at a study that looks at people first off that have mood disorders, and then see how creative they are. So this was studied by Richards et al. From Harvard Medical School, and they looked at 17 people with full manic disorders and also with cyclothymia or with cyclothymia. So this is kind of, and what cyclothymia is kind of like bipolar light. So the people aren't quite bipolar, but they're on their way to being bipolar, as well as their first degree relatives. And that compared with the control group. And they were tested on creativity measure that was designed specifically for the study called the Lifetime Creativity Scale, which includes questions about interests, their profession, their achievement, and their personality. And what they found was that the people that were most creative were the first degree relatives of the manic depressive. The people that had bipolar, the people that were next in line were the people with cyclothymia, and the people that were least creative were those with full-blown manic depressives and the control group. So basically what you have is those people that were not the normal controls and did not have the full-blown disorder, but were in between those two were the ones that were the most creative. So there kind of seems to be a curve. People that had a partial predisposition to an affective disorder seemed to be those that were the most creative, and those who had the light versions, cyclothymia of manic depressive, were the ones that seemed to be the most creative. And what they said in this study was that there's kind of an inverted U, because a little bit of psychopathology may be beneficial to creativity, essentially. A lot of psychopathology was not beneficial based upon this study. So now let's talk a little bit about latent inhibition. So how inhibited are you? What's your tendency in this case? Now, what it appears to be, at least according to the research, is that latent inhibition tends to block creativity. And I think we know that simply when you feel inhibited, you feel too much self-control, you feel too self-conscious, you just don't feel like being creative. You will not be creative because you won't be bold and be as bold as you would be otherwise. So intuitively, I think we know this. But what research has shown is that when it comes to psychotic disorders, that is losing touch with reality. So maybe I should clarify a little bit here some of the Freudian terms. In Freudian language, a neuroses would be something where a person is experiencing mental or emotional issues, but they are in touch with reality. A psychosis is where you have lost touch with reality, objective reality. And what research tends to show is that when a person is disinhibited, that is, they have a lower level of inhibition, there is a predisposition to both higher creativity and the possibility of psychosis. Now, it doesn't mean that creatives are psychotic. It just means that the underlying level of disinhibition appears to have a relationship to these two very different paths. Further research has shown that high IQ combined with low latent inhibition tends to equal high creativity. So high IQ tends to be a mediating factor within this scenario. Now, if we're to look at this further, what we can see is that in the brain, in the mesolimbic levels of dopamine, that is the neurotransmitter that helps you to engage the world, helps you to be more talkative, but also helps you to experience joy and pleasure more, up to a point, also seems to help with reducing latent inhibition and with creativity. But higher dopamine levels can also be associated with psychosis. And of course, this then makes sense because there is a point at which the level of dopamine that you have transitions from being helpful to being destructive. It facilitates engagement, it helps improve talkativeness and the sensation and experiencing of pleasure, but there comes a point at which dopamine levels become too high. And that is when psychosis is triggered. And that is why antipsychotic medications work very much with the dopaminergic systems to block the activation of these dopaminergic systems in order to help a person avoid psychotic episodes. So, overall, what we can see is that there is an optimum level of dopamine that seems to underlie creativity. Not enough and you're not motivated. Too much and you run the risk of becoming psychotic and not productive. So this ties us in with why some creative people drink. Now, it does not seem to be that alcohol helps with cognitive functioning, and so that is not part of being creative and the creative process. Alcohol does not seem to help with the dopamine system because it's a depressant. But what alcohol does seem to do is help improve disinhibition. That is, it reduces the latent level of inhibition. And it is at this point that researchers seem to point to this being part of the reason why alcohol is used by some creative people. As a side note, it's part of the reason why a lot of alcoholics also suffer from anxiety and depression, because they drink because they feel overwhelmed by their latent level of inhibition. So as part of this process, creatives will sometimes drink. So if a creative person is depending upon their psychomotor skills within their creative process, alcohol is not a great help, because there's a decrease in psychomotor activation when you consume alcohol. But psychologically, the reduction of latent inhibition may be what the person feels they require at that period of time in order to be creative. So, we'll end this lecture by asking the question, should one use alcohol or drugs as a means to enhance creativity? And here you need to look at the very fine line that there is between what is needed for creativity versus that cutoff line, which leads to illness, disease, and addiction. And of course, complete dysfunction. And what the research seems to point to, and what I would suggest, is that people generally, in fact, in almost all cases, do not know themselves well enough in all the intricacies of neurochemistry in order to be able to self-medicate to the point of being able to use alcohol or drugs as a means of effectively enhancing their creativity. The cost-benefit ratio simply does not look good. The risks are often too high. The reward is dubious at best. And here I want to quote Shelley Carson of Harvard and her look at creativity and substance use. And she says it this way, quote, "You may get short-term benefit, but the consequences of such actions are almost always, in the long term, devastating and destructive to the creative." End quote. So in the end, what we see is that there is a benefit to being predisposed to developing affective disorders such as anxiety and depression, or mood stability disorders such as bipolar, but not the illness themselves. But in that place pre-illness, having the wiring that predisposes you to those things, because you are more sensitive to the environment, and as such have a tendency to think more divergently, to think more creatively, and to be able to express yourself more creatively. But that does not mean that the use of substances is helpful, or that the disorders themselves are helpful, but rather that there is a borderline between the average person and the sick person, where the creative tends to thrive. I hope you enjoyed this week. You take care. Bye-bye.